A duchess who cannot give her duke an heir should never have become a duchess. The words were spoken softly, almost hidden beneath the music. Even so, Catherine heard every one of them. She stopped outside the ballroom. The orchestra played on. Crystal glasses clinked together. Inside, the guests smiled as though nothing cruel had just been said. "His Grace is still young," another lady whispered. "He deserves a wife who can secure the future of Ashcombe." Several people nodded. No one argued. No one defended her. Only an hour before, the physician had sat across from Catherine in the morning room. His voice had been gentle. His answer had not. She would never bear a child. She had promised herself she would tell her husband that very evening. Instead, the county seemed to have learned the truth before he had. Catherine drew a slow breath. She lifted her chin, just as every duchess was taught to do. Then she turned away from the ballroom. Not because she was angry. Because she refused to let anyone watch her break. The long corridor beyond the doors was quiet. Only the sound of her footsteps followed her. She did not know that someone else had paused before entering the ballroom. He had arrived only moments earlier. He had heard the whispers. Every one of them. The Duke remained where he stood. His eyes followed his wife as she disappeared down the corridor. For the first time since their marriage, he realized she had been carrying a burden he had never noticed. When Catherine married Arthur, Duke of Ashcombe, nearly everyone in London called it a fortunate match. She was well educated, graceful, and came from an old family whose fortune had quietly faded over the years. While Arthur possessed everything her family no longer could: wealth, influence, and one of the oldest ducal titles in England. It looked like the perfect marriage. In truth, it had been a marriage of responsibility long before it ever had the chance to become one of love. Arthur had inherited the Ashcombe title much earlier than anyone expected after losing both his father and his elder brother within the same year. The grief had barely settled before lawyers, advisors, and distant relatives began reminding him of the same obligation that had followed every duke in his family for generations: Ashcombe needed an heir. The estate itself stretched across thousands of acres with tenant farms, woodlands, cottages, and villages that had depended on the Ashcombe family for centuries. Every decision the Duke made affected hundreds of lives, and he carried that responsibility with a quiet determination that few people truly understood. Catherine understood it. That was one of the reasons she had accepted his proposal without asking for promises he could not honestly give. She never expected grand declarations of love. She hoped only that respect, shared responsibility, and kindness might slowly grow into something deeper as the years passed. For almost 3 years, their marriage settled into a gentle routine. Arthur never forgot to ask whether she had slept well before leaving for his morning meetings. And he always made certain her carriage was prepared before she visited the village. Catherine in return quietly learned the names of every servant, every tenant, and nearly every child who lived on the estate. Wherever she went, people found it easy to speak to her, not because she was their duchess, but because she listened before she answered. The servants noticed the difference long before the Duke did. The house felt warmer whenever she was near. Arthur noticed something too, although he never spoke of it. Each time Catherine returned from the village, the reports on his desk seemed a little less heavy, and the silence that usually filled Ashcombe House no longer felt quite as empty. Neither of them called it love. Not yet. But something had already begun to grow between them. Neither realized how fragile it truly was. Catherine waited until the house had fallen quiet before returning to her rooms. The candles had burned low and the corridors of Ashcombe House felt unusually empty, as though the old manor itself had heard the whispers that followed her through the ballroom. She removed her gloves slowly and laid them beside the dressing table, taking far longer than necessary simply to delay the decision she already knew she would have to make. The physician's words had changed nothing about the woman she was. Yet they seemed to have changed everything about her place within the family. She crossed the room and opened the small writing desk near the window. For several moments, the paper remained blank. She dipped the pen into ink once, then twice before finally allowing the first sentence to appear: Your Grace. The words looked strangely formal. She paused, folded the paper, and began again: Arthur. It was the first time she had written his name without his title. The second letter came more easily. She wrote that Ashcombe deserved a future free from whispers and endless questions. She wrote that she could not bear becoming the reason the Duke carried another burden. Nor could she watch his family turn against him because of a marriage that had failed to produce the one thing they valued above everything else. She did not accuse him. She simply asked to be released from her vows with dignity. When the ink had dried, Catherine folded the letter carefully and placed it beneath the small silver paperweight Arthur had given her during their first Christmas together. It had never been an expensive gift. It had always been her favorite. Outside, the first drops of rain tapped softly against the window. She looked toward the great oak tree standing alone beyond the gardens, its branches bending gently beneath the wind. Somehow it seemed stronger in the storm than it ever did beneath a clear sky. Catherine whispered a quiet goodbye that no one was there to hear. Then she left the room. Several minutes later, Arthur opened the door to his wife's sitting room. He had come to tell her something. Instead, his eyes fell upon the folded letter waiting on the desk. He recognized her handwriting immediately. He did not open it. Not at first. Arthur stood alone in Catherine's sitting room for several moments, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the writing desk. The folded letter remained beneath the small silver paperweight she treasured so dearly. He knew it was meant for him. He also knew that opening it without first speaking to his wife somehow felt like breaking the quiet trust they had built over the years. So he left it where it was. Instead, he crossed the corridor and knocked softly on the door to her bedroom. There was no answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. The maid waiting nearby lowered her eyes before speaking. Her Grace asked that the blue room be prepared, Your Grace. Arthur frowned. The blue room? Yes, Your Grace. She said she wished to be alone for a few days. The blue room had not been used by either of them since the first winter after their marriage. It was comfortable but distant from the Duke's private apartments, chosen only when guests filled the house. Arthur thanked the maid and dismissed her. He stood alone in the corridor for a long while. He could have walked to the blue room. He could have asked Catherine to explain. Instead, he turned away. For the first time since their wedding, they slept beneath the same roof, yet in different wings of the house. The following morning, breakfast was laid exactly as it always had been. 2 cups. 2 plates. Fresh bread. Orange marmalade. Arthur looked toward it without thinking. Mrs. Whitmore, the elderly housekeeper, quietly poured his tea. Her Grace has already gone to the village school, Your Grace. So early? She left before sunrise. Arthur nodded and unfolded the morning newspaper, though he never truly read a single line. Outside the dining room window, the old oak tree swayed gently in the breeze. A gardener had tied one of its heavier branches with fresh rope after the recent storm. It looked fragile. But it was still standing. Arthur found himself staring at the tree much longer than he intended. Only after the carriage carrying Catherine had disappeared beyond the front gates did he realize something unusual. Ashcombe House had always been quiet. That morning, for the first time in years, it felt lonely. 3 days passed. The letter remained unopened. Arthur saw it every evening when he returned to Catherine's sitting room, yet each time he reached for it, something stopped him. It was not fear of what she had written. It was the quiet hope that she might choose to tell him herself. She never did. Instead, Catherine spent more and more of her days in the village. The schoolhouse had become her refuge. It was a modest stone building with only 2 classrooms, a small library, and a garden where the children insisted on growing flowers beside their vegetables. Nothing there resembled the elegance of Ashcombe House, yet Catherine found herself breathing more easily each time she stepped through its doors. The children never called her Your Grace. To them she was simply Lady Catherine, the one who listened. The one who remembered birthdays. The one who always carried peppermint sweets in her pocket. On Friday afternoon, Arthur rode through the village after inspecting the western farms. As he passed the schoolyard, laughter drifted across the road. Without thinking, he slowed his horse. Catherine sat beneath an old oak tree with half a dozen children gathered around her. One little girl leaned comfortably against her shoulder while a boy proudly showed her a drawing covered in crooked lines and bright colors. Arthur had never seen his wife laugh like that. Not in the ballroom. Not at dinner. Not even during their first Christmas together. She looked completely at peace. Mrs. Whitmore had once told him that people revealed their truest selves when they believed no one was watching. For the first time, Arthur wondered if he had ever truly known the woman he had married. Just then, a little boy noticed the Duke standing beyond the school gate. He waved enthusiastically, "Your Grace." Every child turned toward him. So did Catherine. Their eyes met across the quiet schoolyard. Neither of them spoke. Arthur offered the smallest of smiles before touching the brim of his hat in greeting. Catherine returned the gesture with equal courtesy. Nothing more. As Arthur rode away, one of the teachers looked at Catherine and asked softly, "Does His Grace always watch over the school?" Catherine looked toward the empty road where he had disappeared only moments before. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I think." She paused. "It may be the first time." Rain arrived before noon and settled over Ashcombe like a quiet grey curtain. By the time Catherine left the village school, the narrow road leading back to the manor had become soft beneath the horses' hooves. She pulled her cloak closer around her shoulders, smiling politely when the children waved goodbye from the doorway. She expected the journey home to be lonely. Instead, another carriage waited beneath the old elm tree at the edge of the village. It carried the Ashcombe crest. Arthur stepped down before the coachman could open the door. "I was returning from the Western farms," he said, almost as though he felt the need to explain. "The road becomes difficult after heavy rain." Catherine nodded. "Thank you, Your Grace." For a moment, neither of them moved. The rain filled the silence between them more comfortably than words ever had. As they walked toward the carriage, a sudden gust of wind swept across the open road, carrying cold rain beneath Catherine's hood. Without thinking, Arthur removed his own riding coat and placed it gently over her shoulders. "It will keep you warmer." She looked at him with quiet surprise. "And you?" "I've ridden through worse." There was no smile. No attempt to make the gesture seem important. He simply climbed into the carriage beside her. The journey back to Ashcombe passed almost entirely in silence. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the windows. Inside, Catherine rested her hands upon the coat folded across her lap. It still carried the faint scent of cedarwood and leather. For the first time in many days, the silence between them no longer felt heavy. It felt careful. As the carriage turned through the manor gates, Catherine noticed the old oak standing against the rain. Its branches swayed fiercely. Yet they did not break. She wondered if people could survive storms in much the same way. Without speaking. Without letting go. The rain continued through the night, but by the following afternoon, the clouds had finally begun to drift away, leaving Ashcombe wrapped in the soft light that always followed a summer storm. After luncheon, Catherine wandered into the east garden carrying nothing more than a pair of gardening gloves and a small basket. The rose beds had suffered from the heavy rain, and several young branches had been bent low beneath the weight of the water. She knelt without hesitation, gently tying each stem back to its wooden support before trimming away the blossoms that could no longer be saved. She had always found comfort in tending things that could still grow, even after they had been damaged. She was so absorbed in her work that she did not hear the footsteps on the gravel path behind her. "I was told I might find you here." Arthur's voice was calm, almost hesitant. Catherine looked up, surprised to see him standing without his coat, his sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms as though he had no intention of remaining a distant observer. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all." For a brief moment, neither of them seemed quite sure what should happen next. Then Arthur glanced toward one of the broken climbing roses. "My mother used to prune those herself," he said quietly. The gardeners were never allowed to touch them. It was the first story he had ever shared about his family. Catherine listened without interrupting. She simply waited. After a moment, Arthur knelt beside her and reached for the loose length of garden twine, resting inside the basket. "I remember very little of her now," he admitted, carefully securing a branch to its frame. But I still remember how she insisted that roses always bloom better after being cut back. Catherine smiled softly. Perhaps people do as well. Arthur looked at her. Not because of what she had said, but because for the first time in many years, someone had answered one of his memories instead of his title. Together they worked until the last rose had been tied back into place. Neither of them noticed the old gardener watching quietly from the far end of the path. He smiled to himself. And for the first time since the Duke's wedding, he allowed himself to hope. Ashcombe House had always awakened before sunrise. The kitchen fires were lit while the sky was still grey, gardeners crossed the lawns before the dew had disappeared, and somewhere within the house, the great clock in the entrance hall marked the beginning of another carefully ordered day. Now he found himself aware of the smallest changes. The fresh flowers that appeared in the library every Monday. The children's drawings pinned beside the school ledger Catherine kept in the morning room. The gentle laughter that drifted through the corridor whenever she stopped to speak with the maids. Instead of simply walking past them, they were little things. Yet somehow, the house no longer felt the same without them. That morning, Arthur entered the breakfast room later than usual. Mrs. Whitmore was arranging the silver tray when she noticed him looking toward the second chair almost without thinking. "Her Grace has already gone to the village, Your Grace." Arthur nodded. "I expected as much." Mrs. Whitmore hesitated. She had served 3 dukes. She knew when silence had lasted long enough. "May I say something, Your Grace?" Arthur looked up. "Of course." The housekeeper folded her hands before her. "When Her Grace first came to Ashcombe, many of us wondered whether she would stay." Arthur frowned slightly. "Stay? There have been other duchesses in history who loved the title more than the people." She smiled gently. "Her Grace was never one of them." Arthur listened without speaking. Mrs. Whitmore continued. "She remembers birthdays. She visits the sick without announcing herself. She knows every servant by name." Then the older woman paused. "And lately, she smiles much less." The room fell quiet. Arthur lowered his eyes to the untouched cup of tea before him. For the first time, he realized something that should have been obvious long ago. Ashcombe had become warmer because Catherine lived there. If she left, the silence would return. Mrs. Whitmore quietly collected the empty tray and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she stopped. "I have served this family for 42 years, Your Grace." When the door closed behind her, Arthur remained seated for a long while. Then, almost without realizing why, he stood. Not to attend another meeting. He walked toward Catherine's sitting room. The letter was still waiting. Arthur remained standing beside Catherine's writing desk for several moments before finally reaching for the folded letter. For days, he had convinced himself there would be a better time to read it. A better conversation. A better moment. Now he understood that waiting had solved nothing. He lifted the silver paperweight she loved so much and unfolded the pages with careful hands. The room was perfectly still. Only the ticking of the small mantel clock disturbed the silence. He expected anger. Perhaps disappointment. Instead, every line had been written with the same quiet grace Catherine carried into every room she entered. She apologized. Not because she believed she had done something wrong, but because she believed she had failed him. She wrote that Ashcombe deserved a future free from gossip, free from pity, and free from endless conversations about an heir who would never come. If setting him free would protect the family he loved, then she was willing to carry the blame alone. There was not a single bitter word. Not one accusation. Only love hidden beneath farewell. Arthur lowered the letter slowly. For the first time in years, the responsibilities of the duchy felt strangely small. The title. The estate, the endless expectations. None of them mattered if Catherine believed she had to face her sorrow alone. He folded the letter with greater care than he had opened it and walked immediately toward the blue room. The room was empty. The wardrobe doors stood open. Several dresses were missing. A traveling case no longer rested beside the fireplace. Arthur felt something tighten inside his chest. He turned toward the maid waiting in the corridor. "Where is Her Grace?" The young woman hesitated before answering. She left for the village after breakfast, Your Grace. Arthur breathed out quietly. Is she expected back for dinner? I don't believe so, Your Grace. Arthur stared at her. What do you mean? The maid swallowed. Her Grace asked the coachman to prepare for a much longer journey. By late afternoon, the drawing room at Ashcombe House had filled with familiar faces. Arthur's aunt sat nearest the fireplace, her hands folded neatly over a polished walking stick. Beside her were two elderly cousins, the family solicitor, and Lord Pembroke, the distant relative. Everyone quietly assumed would inherit the title if Arthur died without a son. No one had invited Catherine. Arthur noticed that immediately. So, his aunt began, the physician's visit has answered the question we have all tried not to ask. No one replied. The silence itself was agreement. The future of Ashcombe must now be discussed. The solicitor opened a leather folder containing family records that stretched back generations. Names, births, marriages, successions. Everything was recorded with perfect care. Everything except happiness. Lord Pembroke leaned forward. There are precedents, he said carefully. Several dukes have quietly sought an annulment when circumstances required it. Arthur did not answer. His aunt continued in the same measured tone. No one questions the Duchess's character. She has conducted herself with grace. She has served this family well. Then came the sentence Arthur had already begun to expect. But duty must come before affection. The room became very still. Arthur looked slowly around the faces gathered before him. Every one of them believed they were protecting Ashcombe. Not one of them had asked what Catherine might lose, or what he might lose. He closed the family register with one deliberate movement. The sound echoed across the room. I believe this meeting is finished. His aunt looked at him in surprise. We have not reached a decision. Arthur met her eyes calmly. I have. Without another word, he rose from his chair and walked toward the door. Behind him, someone called his name. Someone else tried to continue the discussion. Arthur did not turn around. The Duke had chosen his wife before his title. He only hoped he had not made that choice too late. The carriage was ready before sunset. 2 trunks had already been secured behind it, and the coachman stood quietly beside the horses, removing his hat when Catherine stepped onto the front path. She had packed very little. Only the things that truly belonged to her. A few books. Her mother's sewing box. The silver paper knife Arthur had given her during their first Christmas. Everything else would remain at Ashcombe. It had never really been hers. Mrs. Whitmore walked beside her in silence. At the carriage door, the older woman gently took Catherine's hands. You gave this house something it had forgotten. Catherine smiled, though her eyes were filled with tears. I only wish I could have given it more. Before Mrs. Whitmore could answer, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed across the stone courtyard. Arthur. He stopped several feet away, breathing harder than Catherine had ever seen. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The evening breeze carried the scent of wet earth from the gardens. Somewhere beyond the stables, a robin began to sing. Arthur looked at the trunks already loaded onto the carriage. So, you truly meant to leave? Catherine lowered her eyes. I thought it would be kinder. To whom? She looked at him. To you. Arthur shook his head slowly. No. His voice was quiet. You were trying to be kind to everyone except yourself. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat. The folded letter was still there. I read it. Catherine closed her eyes for a moment. I'm sorry. Arthur took one step closer. Don't apologize. You believed I wanted an heir more than I wanted my wife. The words settled gently between them. Then Arthur said the one thing he should have said long ago, Catherine. I never asked you to carry that burden alone. She looked at him, unable to speak. Arthur held out his hand. Don't leave. Not because Ashcombe needs a duchess. He paused. Because I cannot imagine this house or my life without you in it, Catherine's. Tears finally fell, not from sorrow but from relief. Spring arrived quietly at Ashcombe, not all at once. The frost disappeared first, leaving the fields soft beneath the morning sun. Then the first daffodils opened along the garden paths, followed by the roses Catherine had carefully tied back after the summer storm. The east garden had never looked more alive. So had the house. Laughter returned to the corridors. The servants smiled more easily. Children from the village visited every Wednesday afternoon to read in the library Catherine had reopened during the winter, and Arthur found that he no longer hurried back to his study after luncheon. There always seemed to be someone waiting for him elsewhere. One bright morning, Mrs. Whitmore watched from the front steps as the Duke crossed the lawn carrying 2 gardening baskets instead of one. Without a word, he handed one to Catherine. She accepted it with a smile that needed no explanation. Together they walked